God damn it. I can't figure out. I'm trying to like up the quality of the video part of this whole thing. And I got all these cameras. I don't have the proper lights though. I have the incorrect kind of lights, and it's taken me forever to figure out what to do with this.
I'm sure it's going to look a lot better than anything else I've done on this show before.
That is probably true, yes. But that's not the standard that I want to set for myself.
Right.
All right, so I don't know where this conversation is going to go eventually, because it looks like we could talk about many different things, but the starting point is clear. The starting point is the book that you just published online for free. You did it yourself, and it's available on mindbodyproblems.com, and it's a great book. And I know that because, you know, it just came out, and so not many people have read it, but I've read it earlier because I got to do the illustrations for the book. So I want to thank you one more time for that, because that was a lot of fun, and that's something that I haven't done before.
Oh, thank you. Your art really added a lot to the book. That made it a lot more fun for me to have that element introduced.
Well, good. So
thank
you.
So
it's a mutual thing. Yeah. I realized, you know, I was awaiting its release, and then once it was out, I realized I don't know what happens next, and I'm not even sure if you know what happens next, because this is like you've done it differently with all of your previous books.
Yeah, so maybe I should explain why I decided to publish it this way. So I've published 4 books with publishers. Mm-hmm. My first 3 books, I went the conventional route. I had an agent, and I wrote a proposal for what kind of book I wanted to write. I'd give it to the agent. The agent would go out and try to find somebody to give me money in advance mm-hmm. to write the book. And that worked pretty well for my first 3 books. But my second and third book I got pretty big advances, and they didn't pay back their advances. The publishers lost money on me. So the publishers eventually catch on. They're not that stupid. And for my 4th book, The End of War, I had a really hard time finding a publisher. My agent and I split up over it. He didn't want me to write this ridiculous hippie book that we could have world peace someday. And so then I was trying to figure out what book I would write next. My girlfriend, who's in publishing and film, was really pushing me. By the way, I call her Emily in the book. That's the pseudonym. She was pushing me to write a commercial book. She said, okay, it's time for you to, you got this war book out of your system. So write something that people are actually going to want to read. And I wanted to get back in the game of real commercial publishing too. So I came up with this idea. I started going to a lot of conferences on consciousness and the mind-body problem. And I came up with this idea to write a book about how our subjective experiences, the good and bad things that happen to us, affect how we view these old problems, like the problem of consciousness and free will and the meaning of life. And I thought it would be interesting to write it as a series of profiles, to dramatize the idea by showing how these major mind-body thinkers had been influenced by, for the most part, pretty bad things that had happened to them. The collapse of a marriage, mental illness, severe mental illness in a couple of cases that leads to psychosis and hospitalization, a brain tumor in one case. One of my subjects, an economist named Deirdre McCloskey, discovered when she was in her 50s, she was married and had 2 children, that she was actually a woman. Before that, she had been Donald McCloskey. And so I thought this was a fantastic idea with a lot of commercial potential. Because also I just love to write profiles. I think it's one of my strengths as a writer. So I figured, this couldn't lose. And I ran it by a few agents, and the response was not good. They really didn't see any potential in this at all. My girlfriend also wasn't so keen on the idea. She'd never heard of the phrase mind-body problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that it's actually quite obscure. But I just decided to write the damn book anyway. I was so into the idea by this time that I just wanted to keep going. And the reason I could do that is because I have a teaching job.
Mm-hmm.
I teach at a university, Stevens Institute of Technology, that pays me pretty well. And it's changed my relationship with writing in a really dramatic way. I write for fun now, instead of writing to make a living to support myself and my family. So it's very liberating, maybe too liberating. But I just went ahead and decided to write the book. When I was finished with it, I really started wrapping it up last spring, and I had a draft I was pretty happy with. I ran it by one editor who had expressed interest in my work before, and he told me he couldn't get through the first chapter, so that was really depressing. And then I thought at some point, I'm just going to publish this myself. I had run into a computer scientist at a little conference I went to in San Francisco who had self-published a book, and a lot of people had read it. He just had a little donate button, and people had given him quite a bit of money. Mm-hmm. And I thought that sounded like a pretty good scheme. So I would publish it for free. People can give me some money if I like. If they don't, that's fine too. So I see this thing as an experiment. Another great thing about self-publishing, and by the way, I have a cold. I just took a Sudafed before this conversation, and I feel like I just smoked crack. I mean, I'm flying high, so you know you're probably you're gonna have to deal with me being even more garrulous than usual. But
I think that's probably a good thing.
Yeah. Well, I realized that I could do anything I wanted if I published it myself online. I could add photographs, I could add video links, I could take little snippets, audio snippets from interviews and add those to the end of the chapter so people could hear what my subjects actually talked about. A crucial idea was to add art. Mm-hmm. And you know, originally I approached you, I think, just to create a cover image of some kind of knot. And then you came up with this fantastic idea of a knot that consisted of my name and the names of my 9 subjects all woven together with the title of the book in different psychedelic colors, which is just love that. It's so cool. It just embodies the book. And then at some point you said, you know, you're sort of getting into the chapters and you wanted to give a shot at creating mm-hmm. art for each individual chapter. And that also represents the book, because each piece of art you created for each different person is so different from all the others, which is one of the themes of the book, that our lives are all so different. So of course, when we try to answer the mind-body problem, which is really the question of who we really are, our answers are going to be all over the place. They're going to diverge.
Right. I think you're kind of in the zeitgeist with this book, because this is kind of my theory that, I mean, it's not an original theory, but not everybody agrees with that. But I feel really strongly about that just the technological change that we have now, these podcasts, for example, podcasts are becoming a bigger and bigger medium, and, you know, more than newspapers or television or anything. Like if you get on the Joe Rogan Experience, that is a big break for you. And the Joe Rogan Experience is like 3 hours of talking about everything with this one weird dude. And when he invites, like if you see the same person on, you know, a little TV segment or even in print most of the time, like an expert on this or scientist or whatever, you get a sense that, oh, this is the expert, this is the person to listen to, and he has the answers. If you hear anybody talk for 3 hours about anything, it will eventually, every time without fail, it will turn out that that's just a fucking person, and they have some, you know, authority in this area and a little less authority in this other area, and then they'll inevitably say something that you will go, oh, that they don't understand or don't know. And so
Right.
it humanizes them, and to me, it makes their theories actually more compelling, because it's like, if I'm presented with the truth and the expert, I immediately have some reservations about whatever they're going to say. But if I'm presented with a person who has a biography, who has a life, who has, kinks in their just trajectory of their life, and you see how that's connected to the message that they're, putting forth, that actually makes the message more compelling, because you can relate to it on a personal level, and you can see that it comes from, their experience, and they've actually struggled with these ideas and came out, this is their sincere take. But that's a person's take. That's just 1 out of 7, or how many billions we have now.
I like that. Yeah, I think you're right. It makes me, it's sort of a nice gloss on the kind of journalism I've been doing for a long time now. So in The End of Science, I had these profiles of scientists and philosophers, and I was pretty mean to some of them. If I thought that their egos, if they were a little bit too arrogant, I would try to take them down a little bit. And I enjoyed doing that. I just reposted a piece that I did, a profile that I did of Karl Popper for The End of Science. I posted it last month, and a lot of people have been chatting about that now. And I show that Popper was this kind of contradictory figure, that he was anti-dogmatic, but as a philosopher, he preached against certainty, but he himself was this incredibly arrogant guy who would pound the table when he was making points, and would talk about his critics as though they were total idiots. And that, to me, is fascinating, that the paradox of the skeptic who's unable to be skeptical of himself. I think, I'm just agreeing with you that the ideas become richer and more interesting if you understand the context in which they arise, what this person was trying to accomplish. And of course, there are emotions and insecurities, fear and desire that is motivating some of these great ideas. And to disembody the ideas and treat them out of that context, I think it doesn't do justice to them. So I had that idea behind the journalism I did for a long time, but I really decided to go all the way with it.
I think it worked out great. I mean, to be honest with you, when I started reading the book, I thought I'm going to treat it that, it's a gig. I'm going to read this book because I need to produce the art. And I was completely taken away by it. It's a great book. And this humanizing part of it, to me, was the most kind of precious one. So how did you choose? Well, I guess a 2-part question. First, how do you pose the question for yourself, the central question of the book? Like you say, the mind-body problem, but it actually, as the title suggests, it's a whole bunch of different problems tied together. So first part of the question is, what are these questions that you tried answering? And the second is, how did you choose the subject, and why did you choose those people, not others?
Yeah, so I'll start by just trying to say what I mean by the mind-body problem. The phrase is often associated with the problem of consciousness. So in a kind of narrow technical sense, it's about how matter, more specifically the brain, generates a mind, generates mental states. But the mind-body problem is really about all the different puzzles that are related to the mind and to humanity. So it also encompasses free will. It's a puzzle how free will arises out of matter. It encompasses morality. So how do we go from a physical universe to a universe where there's this concept of ought and should? That's a big puzzle. The meaning of life. Where does the concept of meaning and purpose arise in a strictly physical universe as well. So a lot of these problems became acute, and they really came to the attention of philosophers and scientists just over the last 150 years or so, with the rise of very materialistic science. But the way I like to think about the mind-body problem is that it's really just about what we are and how we see ourselves. And this question has bothered people since the beginning of time. All religions are a response to the mind-body problem, if you think of it as, what are we?
Yeah.
Philosophy, all art, literature is a response to that problem, trying to figure out what it means to be a human being and what it means to be a good person and what constitutes a good, meaningful life. So it's this giant mess of interconnected problems, but that can be summarized very simply under this one question: what are we really? And what are we? And that leads to what can we be because of science, because science is constantly giving these technologies that allow us to modify ourselves possibly. And what should we be? So if we have genetic engineering and brain implants and, I think that's a handyman who just came. Yeah, I've got a big hole in the ceiling of my bathroom, and this guy was coming to patch it, but I told him to come back later. So the mind-body problem is, it's just to complicate it even more. It's about personal identity. So each person has to try to figure out what he or she really is, and that involves sexuality, which ended up being a part of some of my interviews. But the mind-body problem is also about what we are as a species. Mm-hmm. How do we think of ourselves, and where are we going as a species? And is there any overarching purpose to it? Which again is a question that is addressed traditionally by religion. So these are the deepest questions that there are. And so part of what I was trying to do in the book is find people who had really wrestled with at least one or more of these questions, and also had that their personal lives had posed some problems that you could consider mind-body problems, like mental illness, like a brain tumor, like sexual confusion. One person, Alison Gopnik, had a midlife crisis in which her marriage collapsed, and suddenly she realized she was bisexual. She'd never considered that before, until suddenly she found herself making love with a woman for the first time. As I said before, the economist Deirdre McCloskey suddenly decided that she was a woman after spending 50 years as a man. I wanted to find people whose personal lives had lots of rich material for storytelling, and whose theories also were intertwined or entangled with their personal lives in some way. So I actually had a whole bunch of people I considered, and then narrowed it down to the 9 people that I included in the book. I had to find people also willing to submit to my questions, my nosiness.
Was that difficult?
About some of them had already written about their problems, or some of them I had heard that they had undergone problems, and some of them turned me down, didn't want to get into it. But the people, the 9 people who eventually agreed to do this, just decided for whatever reason that they had to trust me to write about their most intimate secrets in a way that wouldn't be distressing to them. So I think it's worked out. All of them have seen the book now and have reacted to it, and nobody is horrified and demanding that I take their chapter down. So far, so good.
Was there somebody who was mildly unhappy with it?
Well, the person that I was most worried about was the evolutionary biologist, Robert Trivers. I had a very intense encounter with him. He lives in Jamaica in this house on the top of a mountain, and I surrounded by jungle, and I decided that it would be fun to take my girlfriend down there and spend the night with him. And he's a difficult person. He's been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and he's got a pretty severe temper. I've met him before. He told me about, and he's also, this is one of the themes of the piece, he's got this sort of affinity for violence, for violent people and violent situations. And so I wrote about that, and I wrote about his mental illness and about the struggles that he has had in his life. And I was really worried about his reaction, in part because I admire him so much. He's one of the greatest scientists who ever lived, Robert Trivers. He helped to solve the problem of altruism. Why are humans nice to each other to the extent that they are? But he seems to have, he didn't lavish praise on me, but he didn't react with hostility. So that makes me very happy.
His was my favorite chapter. It's a really rich kind of portrait, you know, the whole circumstance, the jungles in Jamaica, and there is the political dimension to it, and he's a member of the Black Panthers. It's a really compelling read. Even if you're not into evolutionary biology, that's just a good story.
Well, I love trying to find paradoxes or contradictions in great thinkers. And the wonderful paradox that I found in Trivers is that he's an authority on deception and self-deception. He wrote a book called The Folly of Fools that was about deception in the animal kingdom and about why that arose, the evolutionary benefits, and then self-deception in humans, which is a very important part of our psyches. And he had really brilliant insights into how self-deception arose and what purpose it serves. Basically, it's that lying is difficult. Lying requires an expenditure of energy. Some people are really good at lying, but I myself am a terrible liar. And I'm, my brain is on fire if I'm trying to get away with a lie. And so Trivers says that it actually makes sense for evolution to design us so that we can deceive ourselves, because then we lie more effectively. And also there's all this stuff going on below the level of our own awareness. I mean, this is something that Freud has talked about a lot. And yet Trivers, of course, himself, he's this really hot-blooded guy. He acknowledges that he is very prone to self-deception. And there are big blind spots in his own ability to understand himself. So I found that that ended up being a theme of that chapter, and I found that fascinating. And I think that applies to humanity in general.
Right.
That we're so smart, we're so brilliant, we're uncovering the secrets of the universe, we're looking out at the very edges of the universe, and we've completely explored everything here on Earth, and we've understood our genome, and yet we're so clueless still about ourselves. If you look at American politics, you can see just what foolish apes we are, essentially.
You don't have him to qualify American politics. Politics generally, I think, is a pretty big mess.
Right. Yeah. And so, it was just wonderful to me that Trivers, this scientist, who was focused so much on these dark aspects of human nature, embodies them himself. So, I like that chapter too.
Well, it makes sense that, again, I think, I'm repeating myself, but I really think this is a great central point of the book, that there is a connection between what the reality that the person lives in, the way he or she describes that reality, and the theories they produce about that reality, and their personal lives, because everybody's reality is shaped by their lives. Yeah. Jordan Peterson is a big name now, and everybody's talking about the message that he's putting forward, and it's interesting, but I don't understand why, he's done like a million interviews and not one interviewer asked him about like his relationship to his mother or something like that. Because he has, like, I listened to a conversation between him and Rogan, I think, and Peterson he has this very dramatic way of putting things. And he was talking about kind of his ideas for self-improvement. And it always starts with some like, you need to transcend your miserable, wretched self. And Rogan goes, does it have to be miserable and wretched? What if I'm doing okay, but I could be doing better? And Peterson had an answer to that, which, a reasonable answer. He said that if you're trying to work out, a way to improve things, it has to work in the worst case scenario. But that is, for my money, a rationalization, because the actual reason that his theory starts with that in that spot is because he struggled with clinical depression for his whole life. And he's had autoimmune illness, and his family has gone through horrible illness as well. And he's just generally an intense guy, really into history of the 20th century. If you study, Nazism and Bolshevism for, more than a year, your view of the world is going to get darker than when you started. And then you add Nietzsche and Dostoevsky to it. And then, so it's not that invalidates what he says, but it makes, I think it should be a part of the kind of presentation, because then you have more context and you understand better where this person is coming from. And again, to me, that makes anybody's worldview actually more compelling when you understand that it's not just a person, thought these things up. It comes from an experience, from their life, struggles or pleasures or whatever.
Yeah, an experience of suffering. Well, so that reminds me of a chapter, the second chapter in the book is about Douglas Hofstadter, who was somebody who had a big impact on me. I first read his book, Gödel, Escher, Bach, in the early 80s, and I started reading his columns for Scientific American, and he seemed almost like a superhuman figure. He was obviously brilliant, but he wrote about the world with joy and pointed out all these beautiful, magical aspects of the world that sometimes required very close attention and some knowledge of physics and biology and mathematics. And it was extraordinary to me. I always thought of him as a very trippy writer, somebody who was on a permanent acid trip, and then just seeing all these marvels around him, and had the incredible talent to convey those marvels through his writing, and then actually say some very deep things about the structure of reality and how minds work. And so I was really looking forward to meeting him. He agreed to speak to me, and I knew that he had had some sorrow in his life, that he had a wife who had died very suddenly in her 40s. It had a big impact on him. But I still thought I was going to encounter this happy person, more than happy, a joyful person. And he turned out to be somebody who is very melancholy and has a very dark view of the world and sees a lot of ugliness. And I see his writing as a reaction to all that darkness and ugliness. And that to me made what he has achieved even more remarkable, knowing how much he had to overcome to write Gödel, Escher, Bach, and I Am a Strange Loop, and these wonderful columns for Scientific American that are filled with all this wordplay and scientific puzzles and puns. That he has done that in spite of depression or melancholy or whatever you want to call it, that is justified by the very real horror. This isn't pathological. He just sees a lot of the stuff that the rest of us deny. I certainly deny. I've got I think I'm almost pathologically cheerful sometimes in my approach to life, because I just try to deny a lot of stuff. And Hofstadter looks at it very squarely.
Mm-hmm.
So I really admire that as well. And I'm hoping that people who are already fans of his work will appreciate it more after they read my chapter about him.
How did you feel writing about, like for example, you said you were worried about Trivers' reaction to the chapter. What's the general feeling of having to tell somebody else's story? Like, that's a pretty heavy responsibility.
It is. I'm actually always astonished that anybody wants to talk to me. But I think for some people, maybe it's difficult to tell their own stories. And some of my subjects had written about themselves, but maybe there are certain things that they held back and they told me, and they wanted to get these things out there. And maybe they were curious to see what my take on them was. The subject of chapter 1, Christof Koch, K-O-C-H. Sometimes I pronounce it Koch or Koch or Koch or Koch. Anyway, I'll stick with Koch. This great neuroscientist. I've known him since the very early 1990s. And he was the person who gave me the idea for the book, really, because I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, he switched from being a hardcore materialist, basically carrying forward the ideas of Francis Crick, the great discoverer of the double helix, hardcore materialist and atheist who said that what we are is basically just a bunch of neurons. That was a quote from his book, The Astonishing Hypothesis. And the way to understand consciousness and free will and the self and all these things is just with nitty-gritty studies of the brain, getting into the hardware. And so Koch went with that for many years. Then Crick died, and then he had a crisis of faith. He'd been a Catholic. He lost that faith. His marriage fell apart, and he glommed onto this new theory called integrated information theory, a theory of consciousness with dramatic implications. It suggests that consciousness pervades the entire universe, all matter. So this is a form of panpsychism, this ancient mystical idea. And I talked to Koch. I went out to Seattle and interviewed him, and he gave me all his reasons for why this was a really great theory. And then in my piece, I psychoanalyzed him and said that he was, my take on him was that he's feeling the chill of mortality. And strict materialism is kind of boring and anticlimactic. And he wanted more out of science. And I thought, for the same reason that his marriage collapsed, that he became restless in his marriage, he became restless as a scientist and glommed on to this sexy theory with all these amazing implications that went way beyond any kind of conventional materialism. And Christof, actually, now that I remember it, he's seen the book, but he hasn't reacted specifically to the chat. I don't know if he'll be annoyed with my psychoanalysis of him, saying that, his not fear of death, because this is one of the most cheerful people I've ever met, but just his realization that he doesn't have that much time left, that this is what's driven him to go after a very dramatic theory that really can solve all these different puzzles related to consciousness. So, he'll probably disagree with me, but then he has the option of writing me and telling me why I'm wrong, and I can post it at the end of my book in the comments section. You
should talk. I think this is one of the things that I have a small kind of a mission to try to convince you that. Well, my original thought was, I think I wrote you in an email that I think it would be great if you produce an audio version of this book, because audio is, I think, a more personal kind of intimate medium, because you hear the person's voice, and there's a cadence to how they speak, and there's, size and pauses and everything. And the book is personal, both in terms of your own, like throughout these 9 chapters, you put a little bit of yourself in each chapter, and there is a kind of a narrative to the whole book about your own views on these questions. And then each chapter is personal in regards to that particular person. So that was my original thought when I was just reading the book. I thought this would be great as an audio version. But now that the book is out, I think it would be a great thing to follow up with these people, record a conversation, have a podcast, about these things. And it's such an expansive kind of question that you pose. Like when I asked you at the beginning of this conversation, like, what are the questions you are trying to address? It's like all of them.
Yeah.
And this idea of finding the connections between what we are and what we think we are and our personal lives. That's just to me, it's a great premise. It's like a genre. It's a premise for a great podcast that would work beautifully.
I love that idea. Maybe we could do it on Meaning of Life TV. I think some of my subjects would be up for that. Others, I'm not so sure.
Some were on the site already, like Koch. Bob Wright interviewed him, and I think he's not the only one. I forget now who else, but I think
Rebecca Golstein, right. I think also. Yeah, sure. I'll ask them. By this point, they might be just totally sick of John Horgan, and I wouldn't blame them. But
maybe that's their opportunity to get back at you, because you've told their story. Now, like, there's a difference again between a conversation and like a writer's rendition. Like, you have a whole narrative about this guy and about that guy, and now they can, contradict you in direct confrontation, if confrontation is what they're, looking for.
Yeah. What I like about that is that, the theme of the book is that there can't be any end to our quest to figure out who we really are. We constantly change. This happens to us on the level of our individual selves, and it also happens on the level of the entire species, in part because of the theories that we come up with to help us understand ourselves. Psychoanalysis changed us. Behaviorism changed us. Neuroscience is constantly changing us. Genetics and the theory of evolution, in the same way that great art and literature gives us different ideas about ourselves. How could there be any end to that process? So the idea of using the book as sort of the starting point for a conversation, I love it. It's what I had in mind. Of the attractions of putting the whole thing on the web. I've already posted several comments at the end of the book. What's funny is the first 2 people who responded one was a hardcore materialist named Tom Clark, with whom I've had an friendly argument for a really long time over whether free will exists. And the other, he thinks no, I think yes. And the other is Deepak Chopra. Or idealist who thinks that mind is the foundation of everything. And so he's pitching, he says, yeah, nice book, John, but then makes the pitch for his idealism, which is related to quantum mechanics and that sort of stuff. So I love that, and I'm hoping that everybody who has their own favorite paradigm for understanding ourselves will make a case for it. And then if I want to, I can respond. But that's kind of the whole point.
Do you have like a strategy for promoting the book for more people to see it?
Yeah, it's funny. I heard from a scholar who has written nice things about me in the past. He's a scholar who pays a lot of attention to scientific communication, and he said, "Oh, John, this is a great way of brand building and he wanted to see how I sort of built on my reputation with this book. Funny, because I never feel like I know what I'm doing. And the idea that I have a brand that I'm out there promoting, it seems absurd to me, because I always feel like I'm totally incompetent. I'm just kind of hacking away and blundering around in the dark. I've got this blog for Scientific American, so I wrote about the book there. That helps out a little bit. I know a lot of journalists and scientists, and I've sent the book to people who played some role in the book, who had invited me to give a talk on the mind-body problem, or with whom I'd had discussions. So I'm just flailing around out there, hoping that I get some kind of reaction. I'm actually hoping, and here we are talking, I'm hoping that this helps.
Part of the reason I asked that question is I want to strengthen my pitch for a podcast as a continuation of the book, because like books, from my understanding, generally don't go viral on the internet, but video conversations like we're having now can, and podcasts can. And yeah, so that's a great idea. You're a lot younger than I am, so you're much more savvy when it comes to these kinds of things. I'm being a book writer can really break your heart, and so I'm actually I've always tried to manage my expectations and emotions so that I don't expect too much when a book goes out there. This particular book, I'm hoping that I'm more worried about the long term. I'm actually hoping that over the long run, people might discover it, even if they're not discovering it immediately within the next few weeks or months. That I've always thought that good writing sells itself. And so we'll see. And and if people don't have a big response to it, that's okay too. I really loved writing this book. It was so much fun. I loved working with you and Frankie Guarini, the guy who put together the website. That was really fun. I'm enjoying updating it now by posting comments on the site. And so, that in itself has been great. Oh, and by the way, I have a donate button on the site. I have already made $35.97. That's not a bad start.
Yeah, I just got an $18 donation, so I was really psyched about that. I'm getting up there.
It's for 3 years of work.
Yeah. Well, again, this is, I write for love. I always wrote for love, but now I really write almost entirely for love instead of for money. And that's beautiful. It's great.
Yeah, that's the way to do it. Now, as I said already, you are one of the subjects of the book, really. Have your own ideas about this whole conglomeration of questions changed in the course of writing the book?
Yeah, I think I've moved a little bit more towards. Well, I used to be kind of a mean writer and critical, and I always had this idea that what science does is, that scientists are on the right track when they start converging on one way of looking at a problem, and this is what we would call a paradigm, and then even on an answer or set of answers to that problem, and that the more diversity you have in ideas, the more immature the field is. So that means things aren't going well. And that was one of the assumptions underlying certainly The End of Science in my second book, The Undiscovered Mind. And now I've completely shifted on this. Now I see multiplicity of ideas as a wonderful manifestation of human diversity and imagination and creativity. So instead of it being something that I mock, for example, I went to this famous conference in Tucson on consciousness, I went in 1994 when I was staff writer at Scientific American, and I returned in 2016 for the purposes of this book. And it's just a wild and wacky conference with every possible ridiculous theory of consciousness that you can imagine, inspired by Buddhism and other mystical traditions. And psychedelics are really big now. Machine learning, Bayes' theorem, psychoanalysis is still out there. And I actually wrote a piece for Scientific American mocking this lack of convergence. But now I'm much more sympathetic toward that. I see it as, I actually would worry about convergence. Mm-hmm. I think if a lot of scientists, sort of big authority figures, started saying, this is the correct way to understand ourselves, I think that is something to fear. Because it might, especially if it's very persuasive, it might limit our future creative ideas about what we can do, not only how we see ourselves, but even what we can be and what we should be. So that was probably the biggest change in my thinking. Also, I'm just much more, I tried to show that some of my subjects and people in general, we should just cut each other more slack.
Right.
Everybody's trying so hard to figure, life it's not easy. It's actually been pretty easy for me, but even I have had some hard times. I've had a marriage that collapsed. I've been clinically depressed in the past. I even talked to some people. One of my subjects, Stuart Kauffman, who I've given a hard time to in the past, had a terrible trauma involving his teenage daughter, who was killed when she was only 13, and that led him to come up with a theory of mind that allows for paranormal phenomena, because he actually had a vision of his daughter's death before it happened, that he considers to be a genuine paranormal experience. And in the old days, I would have thought, well, I would have felt bad for him, but I would have thought, well, obviously, these emotional reasons discredit him, and they show that he's not being entirely rational. Now I say, no, these are absolutely legitimate reasons for arriving at a theory, even though they are profoundly emotional. So I like to think I'm just a little bit nicer of a person than I used to be.
Yeah, one of the situation with Stuart Kauffman, that's a direct experience that he had, right, that influenced his thinking. And I was thinking in preparation for this interview, one other thing that you and I wanted to talk about is psychedelics and your relationship to them. And I thought one of the most powerful thing about psychedelics is it's an experience. It's like, even if it's easy to rationalize what you've gone through, what you've seen or felt, there are circumstances around the trip, and you did it wrong or correctly or whatever, or somebody said something to you that influenced the trip. Still, if you the experience that you talk about in the book was, am I putting this correctly, you felt that you were God and you were freaking out?
Yes, that's pretty much it.
And it's like, if you have that, if you just that is what do you call it? A data point. That's something that you lived through. That's going to be very difficult to dismiss, even if there are legitimate reasons to dismiss it. I was thinking about it even without touching these complicated subjects, God and free will and everything. I used to go, I don't do that very often now, but I used to regularly attend these oppositional rallies in Russia, anti-Putin manifestations and whatnot. And I would go to one of those, and I would come back and read about this event that I just was a part of. And without fail, it was always I feel like this person, previously, if I didn't go to a thing like there was a time when I never attended anything like that, and I would read reports about it, and I thought I'm getting the information about how it went down. And then when I actually participated in some of them, it became very clear that what you're reading is like some guy who went to the same thing, and he was one of 50,000 participants, and each has a different perspective, because even just based on where in the crowd you stand, people are going to be more excited about that speaker or that speaker. You'll see more nationalists or liberals. You'll experience a different mood of the crowd. The police will look at you differently, maybe in one spot than in the other. And all of that contributes to your experience of that. But then, what a reporter does is comes home and presents this experience of theirs as the actual situation, the actual truth of what happened. And it's never the same thing as what other 50,000 people experienced.
Yeah, so when I went to journalism, 82 and 83, to graduate school in journalism, 82 and 83 at Columbia. And, so there were a lot of very successful journalists who were teaching there. And we were taught that journalism, the ideal we should aspire to is objectivity. Mm-hmm. Figuring out the facts and reporting those to readers, and getting out of the way as an individual yourself, not throwing up your own subjective sensations. And then once I became a journalist, I realized how ridiculous that was. And that, of course, just in the stories that I choose, I'm imposing my own.
Right. You can strive for objectivity, but you're probably not going to achieve it.
Yeah. Well, when I decided, and I've sort of moved more in this direction, and this book, I guess, Mind Body Problems is the epitome of it, is that I can be certainly more honest and maybe more objective in a sense if I'm upfront about my own subjectivity. If I'm telling people exactly why, hold on a second. If I'm telling people exactly why I'm reacting to this particular idea or this theorist in a negative way or positive, to try to be completely transparent, which of course is impossible. But that's my ideal now, is to try to reveal as much of myself as possible. Now that can be really tedious for some readers. It can come across as being very self-indulgent, and sometimes I, as a reader, want just to be given the facts, and I don't want all this sort of hand waving of the narrator in the front. But just going back to psychedelics, I think, I've had some really wild experiences, and you mentioned this one, which I've written about, where I felt like I became God, and I discovered the secret of the universe, that God is really fucked up, really neurotic, and that's why the universe is so fucked up. But the takeaway that's mattered the most to me is that this is what I call the weirdness, that reality is just so bizarre. It's so improbable. There really is no reason for us to be here, and yet here we are. It's the improbability of ourselves as individuals. Like, why am I this thing and not some other thing? But also the improbability of the whole thing. And part of that recognition of how strange everything is it makes me feel that all our theories, our ideas, our expressions, our responses to this crazy mystery are completely inadequate. They fall so far short of what's actually going on. And yet, we have to keep trying. And this is where, this is what science is doing. It's philosophy and religion and all the arts are trying to do. But it seems to me that there should be this recognition that there's this field in theology called negative theology that I love. I wrote about it in my book, Rational Mysticism. The idea is that the fundamental assumption of negative theology is God is that which can never possibly be described. And so then you go on from there,
right,
and you try to describe God after saying that what you're trying to do is absolutely impossible. I think whether or not you believe in God, that's a good attitude to keep in mind. Let's say if you're a philosopher or a scientist or a writer, that you're always going to, you can never capture reality. You can't capture a single person with language and with scientific models. But then that's what we do. You know, we try to figure it out, always failing.
This reminded me of a psychedelic experience I had myself, two actually. But one in particular, when you're talking about the inability to express the thing that we're trying to express, I had this experience on mushrooms with two of my friends where, like, it started out with just laughter, and I'm not entirely sure what the cause of the laughter was. But by the time that sort of like spasm of laughter ended, I was just making sort of monkey noises. And then we proceeded to have a conversation, but I still feel like I maybe have gotten something right at that moment. I was pretty confident that if we want to describe the thing that is worth, if we want to discuss the thing that is worth actually paying attention to, like the actual substance of life, then we should not go away from the monkey noises. That's our best chance to actually communicate about this inexpressible thing. Because as soon as we start putting these sentences together, well, we're going to get trapped in the construction, in the language construction. And in a couple of minutes, you're not talking about the actual thing anymore. You're talking about these things that you've constructed from words. And that was met with some resistance from my interlocutor because he wasn't feeling we're getting anywhere, I think. But so eventually we compromised. And I said, okay, we can use single words. Like you can say a noun and I'll reply with a different noun, but I'm not going to go into this whole sentence bullshit. And he would sometimes he would like produce a sentence or two and I would miss the point of departure, but then catch him and go like, no, you're doing this motherfucking thing again. Where I'm going to go back to the monkey noises if you continue with this language game.
That sounds like a great trip. As long as it's fun, you know. So as you know, I finally gave in to Bob Wright, our mutual friend, the guy who operates this site, Meaning of Life, and went on a silent Buddhist retreat this summer. And I appreciated, as I never have before, how enlightenment is the state of being content right where you are. And as soon as you start thinking, I've got to describe this, I've got to try to figure it out, or even I'm not happy with my emotional state right now, I'd rather be in this different emotional state. As soon as there's any dissatisfaction with the moment that you're in, including just a kind of questioning of it, then it's gone. The enlightenment is gone. And I get that. And I think I'd like to have more of those experiences. But to me, chasing after the mystery is the whole point of life, too. So if enlightenment means being totally content and not thinking, what the fuck is going on, then I don't want to be enlightened. I get my greatest pleasure in life is trying to figure out stuff and then talking to other people like you who are also trying to figure it out and going, I'm totally clueless. How about you? And I'm totally clueless too. It's a great way, especially if you can kind of get paid for it. It's really a fantastic way to live a life. You're going to have some heartbreak because people aren't going to be as interested in the things you're saying as you might like. But if you can squeak by, make a living doing it, it's fantastic. Better than enlightenment. Yeah.
I feel like we're getting into this part of the conversation where it's just story time and exchanging tales of psychedelic confusion. Maybe not necessarily psychedelic. But what you just said reminded me of a different trip that I had with, have you ever done DMT? I know you've done ayahuasca recently.
I've only done DMT in the form of ayahuasca, and I did it twice, and including just last May.
So I want to ask you about that, but just to tail onto the thing that you just said. I had this one, not even the whole experience. It was like 2 seconds at the beginning of a trip that changed my relationship to the Buddhist idea of dukkha, what they call suffering or unsatisfactoriness, or I think it originally comes, I think the etymology of the word has to do with, it's like a bend on an axis of like a carriage or something. Like if you imagine a carriage with 4 wheels and one of the axes just has like a little bend on it, then the carriage is always going to be a little fucked up. And that's, I think that's the etymology of the word dukkha. It refers to that situation. And as far as I understand, in the Buddhist tradition, it's viewed as the fundamental kind of quality of life. There's always this thing that's something's always wrong. There's something to chase after, or something to change or fix or want. And the way it usually is presented, at least from what I've seen in like kind of commentary in English or Russian, when I don't know if an enlightened Buddhist teacher would put it differently, but very often these kind of like introductory texts or lectures or whatever talk about this thing as a problem. Like there's always suffering in life, and here's how we can here's the causes of it, and here's how we can get rid of it. And I always kind of struggled with that, just because I have a natural kind of resistance to big theories that start out with everything's wrong. Like I don't want my life to be more problematic. Like to pose it as a problem at the very beginning is, I have some resistance towards that. But that's how I interpreted this thing, until I had this trip where at the very beginning there was like a short second that changed my relationship to that. So DMT, if you do it not in the form of ayahuasca, but if you smoke the pure thing, it's a very short experience. It's like 15 to 20 minutes, but it's very intense. It's very rich visually, and it's a complete like overload of everything from visual information. There are all kinds of just bright colored details, and you can't catch everything. Everything is in constant flux. And then it's also imbued with all this meaning and emotional component to it and everything. But in the first second of that trip, so before all of this intensity started, I had this, so I took the first, it usually take like 3 tokes to go into this complete departure from everyday life. And I took the 3rd toke and I laid back on the bed, and immediately I was in this hyperspace, this completely different reality. And I was not aware anymore that I have a body or that I'm in a room, but I did have a sense that I'm in some sort of a place and that I'm laying down. And walking away from me was this cartoonish princess, like what's her name, Jasmine in Aladdin, something like Eastern cartoonish princess was walking away from me, and she looked over her shoulder at me and smiled, and it all takes like a fraction of a second, and I was just in a different reality, and suddenly there's already a different person, and she's walking away from me, which implies that she used to be next to me and I'm laying down. What is my relationship to this woman, and why is she walking away? What is that smile? Is it a sympathetic smile, or is she laughing at me? And where is she going to go now? Should I chase after her? All of these questions appear in a split second, and they, bother me, I try to grasp onto something to figure out what I do in this situation. And then in the next fraction of a second, I realize that is the beauty of the experience. It's like beginning of a relationship. If you meet a girl and you really like her and you think she likes you back, but you're not sure and you don't know what's going to happen next, but you just had a good day and you don't need to know the exact future of how it's going to evolve and whether it's going to evolve. You can just enjoy the day you've just had. And in that second, in that trip, I realized that, there's always this thing about life. There's something to fix or something to chase after and some sort of incompleteness to the whole thing. But that's not a bug to me. That's like, if you didn't have that, if world could be completed, well, then we would complete it and then it's over. And then you can continue playing the game.
It's, by the way, I love talking about trips. That's an amazing vision. And the question is what you do with these things. What I came out of this, I had this one big trip in 1981 where I was in a trance state for about, I don't know, maybe 16 or 18 hours, and just total visions. I didn't know where I was. And this is when I thought, for a while I became God. And I thought of God as being in this kind of loop, chasing himself somehow, trying to catch up to himself and trying to understand himself. So in a way it was sort of mental and physical, seeking comprehension, but also like physically chasing. And at some point I realized that if he ever caught up, everything would vanish. Mm-hmm. That this chase was the reason for existence. And, we're all manifestations of God chasing himself. And so when I came out of this and, for this trip really rocked me. I was having flashbacks for about maybe 6 months. And I was completely alienated from everybody around me. I just didn't know how to describe it, especially because I thought I had discovered the secret of the universe.
Uh-huh. That's always a red flag.
Yes, definitely. And I was actually fearful that because I had discovered the secret, there was no reason for it to exist anymore. And that if I kept dwelling on this answer I discovered, everything would vanish. I was psychotic. That's a psychotic realization. On the other hand, I still think of it as having some kind of kernel of truth in it. This is something I tried to express in my chapter about Douglas Hofstadter, who's got this concept of the strange loop, this thing that sort of generates itself, has some kind of complicated relationship with it itself. That to me describes this feeling that I had about God, the sort of creative principle of the universe. So, and to me, that idea is kind of terrifying and really comforting at the same time. So when let me just ask you, you have an experience like this. How do you integrate it into your normal waking, rational existence? Is that difficult? Is it something that you actually try to do?
I try to. Well, so one important thing is just not to do these things too often, I think. Like I've met people who do drugs regularly, or not just regularly, but like constantly. And I don't think you can integrate these experiences if you don't give it a pause. But for me, it's just talking, actually. I think that's the most important thing. Like with these, especially with these like intense psychedelics, I think part of what they do is you have to recreate your reality within that experience. Like it's actually happening every breathing second of our lives. We're creating our reality just by perceiving this reality and then by adding interpretation layers on it and so forth. But it's just way more direct and intense in those experiences. and you're kind of more aware that that's what actually happening, like with you being that God, like you were creating the reality in that moment from this kind of godlike perspective, but you do it like you're talking to me now, and we're now adding information to our own lives, and you're going to be a slightly different person after this conversation, and I'm going to be a slightly different person, and when you change who you are, then you change the toolkit that you have for perceiving, the next day. And so to me, when you go through this kind of thing, so you go through some intense psychedelic trip, you find yourself in a slightly different world than you were a day before. And then I talk to people whose opinion I value, and I talk about things that I've thought about and ideas that I have, and how my world now is slightly different. And if I start seeing that a person has this changed look in their eyes, thinking Nikita seems to be going off the deep end, then I take a step back, because like if you know that you're creating your reality, you should have that should come with some responsibility, with some integrity. You shouldn't do it willy-nilly. And so that, I think that to me is the most grounding thing. If my new understanding of what's going on can be expressed to the friends that I have, I have friends who are crazy. I have friends who are completely irrational, materialistic. I have, my mother who's reaching 70, just a very straightforward Soviet woman. And if I can explain my new idea to all of these different kinds of people, and it makes some sort of sense to all of them, then I keep that. And if I can't, if some of them, I see these people that I value thinking, okay, I don't know what the fuck he's talking about now, then I, pause and rephrase and rethink it. I think that's the most important thing to me, the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a couple of responses. First, listening to you, it makes me think, and I think I told this to you when we first had an email exchange. You have got to write a book about being whatever you are, like a psychedelic philosopher in Russia.
No.
I mean, Jesus Christ, what a talk about a weird situation. That sounds fascinating to me. But also because there might be other people out there who feel completely lonely and alienated, who are having some strange experiences. Then they read about your experiences, and it gives them the exhilaration of recognizing that there are people who are going through similar things out there. I mean, this to me is going back to the mind-body problem. One of the great puzzles is how we get out of the prison of our own selves. Mm-hmm. So there's the problem of solipsism, is that I can't be sure that anybody else is conscious in the universe. You seem to be conscious, but I can't be absolutely sure. And so literature, in a way, science doesn't really do this very well, unless you're talking about scientists like Freud or Jung, or people like that. But literature, the arts, are a way of sort of breaking through the prison of ourselves and seeing into the selves of other people. And that can be the best experience that there is, where you suddenly realizing that you have this commonality that you didn't expect. It's something that had made you feel very lonely and alienated. These feelings that you had, you share them with these other people. And with psychedelics, it's especially important to have these sharing experiences. I'm glad you can find people to talk to about these sorts of things, because as I said, in my case, after this one big trip, right, I felt like I was completely sealed off from everything around me.
Well, I mean, when I talk to my mother, I don't tell her all of the details about the drug part of it. But if I have some insight that came from the trip, that I can formulate and try to see whether that's, whether the message is being received and understood or not.
That's great. I remember after Rational Mysticism came out, I was asked to do this public event in New York City where I talked about my my book, actually with this famous Buddhist, Robert Thurman. But in the beginning, I was starting to talk about my relationship to mysticism and how I'd always been interested in psychedelics. And my father was in the audience. My father was this sort of businessman, very straight guy, real old fashioned. And I had to pause. I was sort of looking at him and I said, you know, it's really weird for me to be talking about this stuff with my father here watching me, because, you know, he was horrified when he learned that I was doing drugs when I was a young man. And now it's turned into a career path for me. Here I am talking about it. I wrote about it in this book. So you're fortunate you can talk to your mother in any way about these sorts of things that are important.
Yeah. Now that gut trip that you had, did you find any? Oh, wait a second. I'm getting a call on Skype from Bob. Yeah, so I wanted to ask, have you looked into, like, what you described that you experienced at that trip actually has connections to, like, for example, Gnosticism, right? Was that a way for you to integrate that thing and to think about this? Have you looked into these things?
Oh, that's my handyman coming back. Let me just, okay, we got like 15 minutes. All right. So yeah, I had this experience, and as I said, I felt like nobody had ever had an experience like this before, and that I had really sort of stumbled onto something that I shouldn't have. And so it was, and then it was disrupting my life. So I put it aside, but then it started coming back to me when I was writing The End of Science, because The End of Science is about, you know, how far can we go? What are the ultimate limits of knowledge? Can we really figure out what we're doing here and what the purpose of it is? And I thought that I had learned that in this trip. So I thought I would tack it on to the end of the book. And I actually worried about putting it in the book because I thought it would totally discredit me. Right. People would just think I was a nut. The reviewers kind of just skipped over it. By the way, the chapter is called The Fingernails of God. And that phrase, the fingernails of God, came from Bob Wright, because I was describing my trip to him, that God is really anxious and neurotic. And, you know, that's where creation comes from. And Bob said, you know, you can imagine Bob's expression. He's looking at me like, and he said, so you're saying that everything comes down to God chewing on his fingernails? And I said, yeah, that's it, exactly. So then the book came out, and then I got a lot of, so reviewers pretty much ignored that. A lot of readers wrote to me about that. And they said, you know, Jung had an experience very similar to yours, where he had an experience of God as being psychotic. And the Gnostics, this is when I heard about Gnosticism. And so then I realized that there's a kind of alternative theological literature that assumes that there's something wrong with God. Right. Even the Jewish Kabbalism has the idea that something went wrong with creation. There's something broken, and somehow we, with God's help, have to fix it. All those were very close to the experience that I had. So I actually ended up writing about a lot of those different ideas in rational mysticism.
Did that help, or did that freak you out more?
It was very consoling in a way to know that, because I really did feel like I was just crazy. I went back and forth thinking I discovered everything, to thinking that I should be in a mental hospital. So it was comforting to discover that other people had similar ideas, and to try to share them, to get people to take this seriously. Part of me is a hardcore skeptical materialist, atheist / agnostic, but I'm fascinated in part because of psychedelics by some of these other ways of understanding reality. And I just realized that materialism is grossly insufficient.
So you seem to be keeping this whole thing like open-ended. Like if you were one of the if somebody else wrote your book and you were one of the subjects for one of the chapters, would you present some sort of a theory, some sort of a message, or would you be, I don't know?
I think I would say, and this is what I've done in my own books, I had this experience. It gave me this crazy idea. Here you go. What do you think? And some people have responded to that, and they seem to like it. It hasn't caused great reforms in theology and philosophy, but it's gotten a hearing out there.
I like that,
and that's all I can expect.
I like that. That's what I think you and I both are fans of Terence McKenna. Would that be correct?
Okay, I'm going to hold something up here. I happen to be reading this new book by a writer named Tao Lin called Trip. And it's all about Terence McKenna, sort of like a biography of Tao Lin and of Terence McKenna. And it's a great book because it really captures McKenna.
I should pick it up.
And his McKenna, who I interviewed for Rational Mysticism, also had this idea that the fundamental psychedelic experience is that everything is really weird.
Right.
And so what do you do with that? How do you respond to it? And he had all these crazy ideas.
The reason I brought him up is one of the most endearing things about him to me is that he can go on for like hours presenting these different theories and ideas of his that can be compelling or can be, some of them, I think even I'm yet to meet a Terence McKenna fan who accepts what Terence McKenna says. There's always like, he's definitely crazy. This is definitely too out there, but it's still interesting, etc. But he would go on for hours talking about these things and then sometimes say, I hope you understand, I don't believe any of these things that I say. I'm just trying to come up with a good story, Yeah.
Right. A story maybe that's better than Catholicism and Buddhism and some of these other old traditions, which have gotten a little stale. Yeah, that's what I love about McKenna too. I actually went and heard him speak in 1999. This is right before I interviewed him. This is the year before he died. And I met some people in the audience and they believed what he was saying. For example, he was saying that he was predicting that something really dramatic was going to happen in 2012.
Right.
And a lot of people believe that. And then when I interviewed him, I said, come on, do you really believe that? And he said, no, he's just trying to wake people up. I thought of him as like a performance artist. And, he's constantly undercutting himself by being kind of a clown, a holy fool. And I think that's that's certainly an appropriate way to try to confront the mystery. By just sort of emitting monkey noises like you were.
That's right. I'll share quickly one more psychedelic story because we talked about your experience with being God. I had a very different experience of a similar nature. I was actually reading Robert Wright's book, Evolution of God at the time. And so I think in the background of my mind, I just had this, I was reading about the change that Yahweh, the Old Testament God, went through historically. So at first he was just one of the gods in the pantheon, looks like a war god. And then he became still one of the many gods out there, but this is the God that this particular tribe made a contract with. And so they were not supposed to worship anybody else. And then in a peculiar twist of fate, after a complete destruction of the temple and the capturing of his believers, somehow that led to the idea that actually is the only God and everybody else might only exist as like pawns, his tools, but there's only one God, and that's that original God. So I had that in the background of my mind, and then I took some acid, and then in the middle of that trip I thought, I wonder what happens if I put on some Buddhist mantras. And I typed in some like Om Mani Padme Hum in YouTube, and there's like a half-hour recording of a whole bunch of monks chanting in unison. And very quickly something started happening. And I guess that's what people call an out-of-body experience, which is I was completely aware of what's going on. I was conscious. I was lucid, but I had this kind of like bird's view of the room. And I saw who just a second ago I thought was me, this person sitting at this desk listening to Buddhist mantras. But now I was just this disembodied consciousness perceiving this whole thing and being able to control that person. But I had nothing to, like, that was not me. I was this just pure consciousness that maybe perceived the world through this particular person, but not anything more like tied to that body. And I thought, if I wasn't myself, if I was instead a leader of a warring ancient tribe wandering through the desert, and I had that kind of experience, it would be very clear for me what to do in this situation. I would jot down some basic rules for how the tribe should operate. And like a third of those rules would be about making sure that, you know, me, this like godlike creature, would keep reproducing. So like it would start with, okay, I'm your God. There are no other gods beside me. Do not worship other gods. That would be like a third of the thing that I would make this person write down. And then the rest would be, don't kill, don't steal, don't fuck each other's wives. It was some basic rules. And so I really think that might be what happened. Like that there are theories that even that particular religion, there are like theories that the acacia, the burning bush was the acacia tree that's rich with DMT, and that what Moses saw. But even outside of that, like, so I was in this position. I thought, well, if I were in that ancient situation, I would write some basic things down. But now, what do I make Nikita write down? Because I can do the same thing. I can say, okay, I'm God. Here are the instructions. And I had nothing. I was like, he already knows you shouldn't kill people. And what kind of advice am I supposed to give to him? And I had nothing. It was an experience that phenomenologically, I was something like a god, like a disembodied entity that can control a person. And, is not, I didn't have any, fear about, I was controlling, myself as you control a unit in a computer game. Like that's not you, but that's how you play the game.
Right.
And I really had nothing. I didn't write down any profound advice or anything. I think I wrote something down which basically amounted to what you're saying, like, this thing happened, I'm experiencing this now, but I don't know what to tell you, man. I don't know what to do with that.
Wow, that's a pretty wild trip. The enduring takeaway from this trip that I had that we've been talking about is, so I grew up Catholic. Mm-hmm. And I think as a residue of that, I stopped being Catholic when I was maybe 11 years old or so. But I'm still fascinated by the idea of God and by sin and things like that. And the problem of evil. Why is there so much suffering in the world? If God loves us and God is all powerful, then what the fuck?
Right.
Life is really terrible for a lot of people. And this psychedelic experience I had gave me the answer to that God, that creation is this kind of desperate act of God trying to take flight from himself. And it's got to be dramatic enough to be a genuine distraction from God's identity crisis.
That's a good way of putting it.
And then that leads to all the the suffering and unfairness and the drama and cataclysms in human history. It's as good as any other response to the problem of evil that I know of, but it's inadequate like every other response too.
Right. So we come back to the takeaway point from your book. What we can hope for are many different perspectives, hopefully good ones, but it's not likely that we're going to come onto the truth with a capital T.
If people start talking that way, then to my mind, something has gone wrong in human history. We crave certainty, we crave the big answers to everything, and it's difficult being in this state of doubt. But God help us if we all decide that we figured everything out.
That's a good way to end this.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much, John. I really enjoyed this, and hopefully we can do something like that down the road.
Me too. By the way, if you like, you really should check this out, this book. He might even be a good Blogging Heads subject. His previous book was called Taipei, and it was all a book about his hardcore drug use. And this book is about how he went from anti-anxiety pills and antidepressants, and he was doing a lot of ecstasy, to psychedelics, and came out of existential despair and actually started enjoying life. And so far, it's really great.
Okay.
And he writes about drug experiences in this way that's so direct that it's really like nothing else I've read.
I'll definitely pick it up. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll send you a link about it. Okay, man, I've got to eat some lunch now. So that was really great, Nikita. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye.
So long.